Hi, this is Joe Barbieri from the New City Library Reference Department, and this is History Bits, where we examine a piece of Rockland County history. Today we're going to be exploring another instance when Rockland County experienced a pandemic, and that's the 1918 Spanish flu. As we're currently experiencing COVID-19, we can make a lot of parallels to what was going on about 100 years ago. Today we're going to be looking through some of Rockland's old newspapers to explore what was going on at the time. We'll be pulling mostly from the Nyack Evening Journal, the county's daily paper at the time, and this is the predecessor to the Journal News. It covers news from all around the county, but there definitely is a Nyack bias, so a good chunk of our news is going to be coming from Nyack. We'll also be using the Rockland County Times. This was a weekly paper that was based in Havistraw, so we'll be using their coverage as well. It's just not the day-to-day reporting that we get from the Nyack Evening Journal. Before we jump in, let's get some background information on our topic. The 1918 influenza epidemic, sometimes called the Spanish influenza, was like today's situation with COVID-19. It was a worldwide phenomenon. A major role in the 1918 flu spread and naming comes from World War I. During the war, there was a lot of international movement of troops going back and forth across oceans, and of course, even within countries, as they had to mobilize their soldiers, they were moving them around a lot too. So within countries that were participating in this war, there's just this great deal of movement. And we'll even get some hints of this as we look at our newspaper articles today. Now, the name of the disease. Spain was neutral in the war, and they didn't have the same wartime restrictions on the media. There was a lot of censorship on the part of the countries that were within the war for the news media. So because of this, the disease was reported on there more freely, and it seemed like, even though maybe the case it wasn't actually worse there, that it really was. And historians are still debating about where this outbreak started. There are a bunch of different theories out there, but no one can really pin it down. Like many diseases, it moved around the world in waves, and Rockland is affected mainly in the fall of 1918 into 1919, and we probably peak around mid to late October of 1918 here in Rockland County. One of the first mentions of the flu locally came in the Evening Journal on September 27th, 1918. It mentions that there has been an outbreak at the Army camp, Camp Merritt, which is just over the border in Dumont, New Jersey. And what's interesting is it couldn't have been the first time the public has heard about the flu. There isn't an introductory paragraph explaining what it is, and it calls it by name. It says it's the Spanish flu. I'd imagine that Rocklanders had heard of this somehow in the war news from Europe already by now. The main thrust of this article was that there was supposed to be a group of soldiers from Camp Merritt who were going to come up to Nyack to attend church services there the following Sunday, and they wouldn't be able to because of this now. So, like today, the situation with the disease escalated very rapidly. On October 1st, just 4 days later, in the Nyack Evening Journal, we see an article stating that the Red Cross has been requested to ask the folks in Nyack to help sew 10,000 masks. These masks are not completely unlike the ones we have today. They're a little bit kind of a modified version of that, and we'll show a picture here of some folks making them, and someone wearing them, actually. And it says this order came from, just quote, the government. So I don't know if this is a wartime thing. It does mention for the soldiers, the encamped soldiers, and but they also just say that this epidemic threatens the country. So there's kind of this big sense of urgency that pops up all of a sudden, not unlike what we saw today. On October 4th, we see a few tips from the Surgeon General printed in the Evening Journal, and it seems like the Army is obviously trying to fight the disease right now. So these are the tips that he has for folks, mostly common sense stuff, and still some of this advice we'd probably be heeding today too. Not gathering in large groups, smothering your cough and sneezes, washing your hands, and at this time there's this big emphasis on keeping clean. He says, remember the 3 C's: clean mouth, clean skin, clean clothes. There's also some kind of interesting advice. I guess this is still kind of this holdover about like the idea of having good, fresh air. It says, open the window, always at home at night, and at the office when practicable. And finally, his last bit of advice is, when the air is pure, breathe all of it you can. Breathe deeply. So this big emphasis on cleanliness, which is still something we have today, but also this big emphasis on fresh air as well. On October 7th in the Evening Journal, we learned from the Red Cross that the quota for the 10,000 masks has not been met yet, and Nyackers are reminded of the hours that they can go into the Red Cross office and work on these masks. Also on October 7th, we're getting our first real look at how flu is being fought in parts of the county. The schools are remaining open in Nyack. The thinking at the time is that children were better off in school, where if they showed symptoms, they could be sent home, then turned loose. I think if the worry was that if children were running around, if school was canceled, they would potentially be spreading the disease from house to house. On October 8th in the Evening Journal, we have the first news of death in the Nyacks. In South Nyack, Amy Dessar Rohr, she is the wife of Charles A. Rohr and the daughter of former Judge Leo C. Dessar. She passed away in South Nyack. She was 27 years old. We also see in this issue that Dr. Charles D. Klein is asking everyone to wear gauze masks, and Dr. Klein is the health officer of the village of Nyack, and he is urging everyone to take more precaution. We also see in this issue that the schools are still open, although it looks like a lot of students aren't going into schools. Dr. Klein is still of the mind that they'll be better off going in school where they can be monitored for symptoms. But keep in mind, that's just the Nyack schools. We also find out that the schools in Pearl River and Nanuet and Muncie are seriously affected, and they are closing in response to the disease. But there is some good news in the paper today. Mrs. F. Cramden, the chairwoman of the local chapter of the Red Cross, is pleased with the number of people coming in to make the masks and the number of masks that are being made. So there's a little bit of good news. And for the next segment, we're going to jump ahead a few days to October 14th. And in the Nyack Evening Journal, we see that the Nyack schools have still not closed. They're holding true to this idea that the students are better off going in than to be running around town and spreading the disease. There's still a great deal of concern, though, because in the past 24 hours, there have been another 4 deaths in Nyack. Miss Bessie Edwards, Miss Ruth Kitterer, Mrs. Fred Turfler, and John Donahue have all succumbed to the flu. Some of the public gathering places are still open in Nyack, however. We also see that M. Mirabel, he's the proprietor of the Broadway Theater. He says he would close his theater, but he points out that his theater is very well ventilated. So we're still subscribing to this idea of that fresh air will combat the flu. On October 16th, we see an article that details some of the methods that people are using, and I guess you would call some of these would be considered folk remedies or preventative measures for the flu. So the first method is to put a piece of gum camphor right on your lower neck there, and I guess that will keep the bad vapors away. The second method is to use tobacco, and I guess the smoke kills the germs. And finally, the last method that people are using is good old-fashioned alcohol, and they say that the most popular is the slandered John Barleycorn. So remember, we're right on the verge of national prohibition here, so John Barleycorn might be slandered, but people are still giving him a shot in order to kill those influenza germs. At this time in the newspapers, we also see lots of ads for these miracle medicines that are going to save everyone from the flu, either cure them of it or prevent them from getting it in the first place. So we'll take a look at a few of these now. Returning back to our chronology in the papers, on October 17th, telephone subscribers were asked not to make frivolous or unnecessary calls and spend too much time gossiping on the phone. There's a double reason for this. People are making a lot of calls on the telephone instead of going to see one another, and that there's also a shortage of switchboard operators at several of the switchboards in the county. They're reporting that 8 of the 9 ladies who operate the switchboard up in Suffern are in fact sick. So just like today, we see a big strain on a lot of the public services and utilities out there. In the Evening Journal, in the national section, on the next day, the 18th, we have a very long article about the origins of the flu, what happens to its victims, and it's just some general tips at the end of the article for what everyone can do to help stop the spread. First, it speculates a little bit about the name and talks about how maybe because King Alfonso of Spain was stricken with the flu in the past, and that's was widely reported on, that's how it became known as Spanish flu. But other than that, they're not too sure of the origins if it did actually start in Spain. Next, it goes into the symptoms that the victims are feeling, and it says, quote, "It resembles a very contagious kind of cold, accompanied by fever, pains in the head, eyes, ears, or back, or other parts of the body, and a feeling of severe sickness. In most of the cases, the symptoms disappear after 3 or 4 days, the patient then rapidly recovering. Some of the patients, however, develop pneumonia or inflammation of the ear, meningitis, and many of these complicated cases die." End quote. So that's the understanding of the flu at the time. So what can we do in order to prevent the flu? Well, according to the article, if you are sick with it, you need to isolate yourself. So a lot like what we see today with isolation, being advised for people who do become sick with the COVID-19 virus. And in order to not get sick in the first place, people are advised to avoid big crowds, theaters, streetcars, things like that. And there's a big warning against people coughing or sneezing near other people, and that's really going to spread the disease. In fact, we have a little cartoon, "Coughs and sneezes spread diseases, as dangerous as poison gas shells." And we're in World War I right now, so that mentality, that's why they're making that comparison to the poison gas shells. On October 19th, we're probably peaking right now in Rockland County in terms of number of cases of the flu. The Evening Journal reports that there are 800 cases of influenza in Upper Nyack, Nyack, and South Nyack right now. However, public places like theaters and restaurants are still open in Nyack. The schools are also remaining open, and that decision was made despite the protest of some of the high school students that they were not being examined or they weren't being checked on to make sure that they didn't have symptoms. The Daily Update article on the flu mentions that there was a meeting of the Board of Health and the school administration, and some of the high school students did come in to protest this, to say that, hey, we're not being looked at. And then the paper actually does list the high school students who did come by to protest this. Things may be open in Nyack, but we're seeing in other parts of the county more drastic actions are being taken. For instance, in Suffern, all schools, churches, lodge room, motion picture theaters, and public meeting halls have been closed. And in Spring Valley, there was a special meeting of the Board of Health, and they closed all schools, Sunday schools, and theaters. Restaurants are still allowed to be open. However, here's the quote from the paper: "Hotels, soda counters, ice cream saloons, and restaurants were ordered to wash all glasses, dishes, knives, and forks and spoons in boiling water and soap after every using, under penalty of being closed entirely if this order is not fully complied with." End quote. So we see that some areas of the county are taking more drastic actions in order to help stop the flu. This is probably the peak time period for the flu in Rockland County in terms of number of cases. We're going to see things gradually getting better. We're still going to see, unfortunately, a lot more names showing up in obituaries, but we are going to see things gradually improving over the next couple of weeks. On Monday, October 21st, in the Nyack Evening Journal, we finally have some good news. And that is that the number of cases is declining for the first time in a few weeks rather than climbing. Dr. Klein, the village's health officer, is still warning that people have to be careful and observant, and they need to still be taking precautions, but things are looking a little bit better for the first time in a long time. And there was, on Sunday, the day before, a whole bunch of pamphlets that were passed out, kind of reminding people to be clean, not to always use handkerchiefs, not to use common drinking glasses, and kind of just to try and stay in the best shape they can be. It says keep fit regularly, sleep a lot with the window open, and exercise in the open air. So kind of just reminding people for good health in general as well. Finally, it reminds us that all these things that we're doing to fight the flu will also help against colds, bronchitis, and pneumonia. And then the last sentence is, do your part to keep them away. Nyack did manage to keep public places like theaters and restaurants and businesses open during this epidemic. Just like today, there was probably a lot of debate amongst the people in the village balancing the economic factors versus the human factors here. But they did manage to keep most things open in Nyack. On October 22nd, in the Nyack Evening Journal, we see that Alfred E. Smith, a Democrat who was running for governor of the state that year, he was unable to speak in Havistraw. Havistraw pulled his permit because, again, we don't want to have big groups of people or political rallies or that type of thing. So he didn't hold a rally in Havistraw, but he would go on to win the election in November. And by the way, this was the first election in which women had the right to vote in New York State. On October 26th, in the Rockland County Times, we do have a grim headline. It says, quote, death rate continues. Local undertakers unable to provide funeral arrangements or secure proper burial equipment, end quote. However, the headline, which is basically just a header to the obituary section, does say that, quote, apex thought reached, and that a, quote, decreasing number of cases leads doctors to think the influenza has spent its force, homes doubly bereaved, end quote. And that's because there are many families that are losing multiple generations in these obituaries that are listed after that headline. But like it said, it looks like the worst is through. In this edition, we also get word that there are several cases going on in Rockland Lake and with recent deaths, but there are also people making recoveries in Valley Cottage. So, news from around the county in this edition of the Rockland County Times as well. The following week, on November 2nd, the Rockland County Times lists 26 individuals and several families suffering from the flu in Garnerville. So we still have little pockets around the county there where we have flare-ups of the flu. Cases seem to be slowing down in Rockland County at this point, and the coverage is getting more and more sporadic. So that does seem like it's a good sign. In the Nyack Evening Journal on December 5th, an article reports that there has been a massive toll on the country with between 300 and 350,000 deaths from influenza since September 15th. Now that's a national number, but still that gives you an idea about the magnitude of the crisis countrywide. That same week, on December 7th, in the Rockland County Times, it makes a comment that the flu is still around in Havistraw, but definitely not as prevalent as it had been a few weeks ago. And those are some of the last major reports that we'll see in the paper on the flu. From time to time, we'll still see an obituary that kind of alludes to the fact that the person passed away from complications from the flu over the next couple of weeks, but we really don't see any more major coverage. However, just like to make a parallel to today, there are worries that the disease could come back and we might see other flare-ups and new cases down the line. In the case of the flu, it doesn't really seem like that happened a whole lot. It does seem like there were some cases in the following years, but we don't have a great pandemic situation like we did in the fall of 1918. Another parallel to our current situation today is the disastrous effect on the economy. In 1919, we have an article on the impact of the flu. And there was first this study done in Illinois, and then what they did with that is they kind of extrapolated that and averaged everything out and came up with a figure for the entire country. And the total cost of the 1918 pandemic being totaled to about $1 billion in damages, and that's a staggering amount of money at the time. The article also calculated nationally that there were about 400,000 deaths. So definitely a big impact on the country in terms of economics and lives lost. Just like today, perhaps the most devastating aspect of the pandemic is the personal toll it took on individuals and families. In Linda Zimmerman's 2002 book, Rockland County, Century of History, John Scott, the former senior historian at the Historical Society of Rockland County, was tapped to write the section on the flu. He relates many of the stories that we heard. For instance, there not being enough caskets available to bury the dead. And he did relate the very personal toll that it had on his life. He said, quote, "This writer's family was broken up suddenly by the flu in 1918. My father died in October, my 1-year-old brother died the following day, and I, 2 years old, was stricken on the third day. A doctor came to the house, but said he could not help me. My mother, hysterically crying, picked me up and flung me against her shoulder, and somehow the lung and flu congestion flew out of my mouth and I was saved. We both live or are living to a ripe old age." So there we have a very personal story from a very well-regarded local historian in Mr. Scott. Yes, the flu was very devastating for Rockland County. It was the only time in the county's history that we saw a dip in our population in the census. The 1910 population was 46,873, and the population total collected in the 1920 census was 45,548, a difference of 1,325 people. But the county was obviously able to pull through. Let's hope that we can do the same today. And that's our quick look at the influenza epidemic of 1918 and how it impacted Rockland County. This has been another segment of History Bits, and we look forward to seeing you back in the future as we take a look at the past. Take care.